So one of the things that I talked about was this thing in here. We have this always iterate by pointer, and what's that about? And well, that's a value that it's actually a compile time parameter that we put on the bucket array. And by default, it's false, so that whatever you get when you iterate is whatever value you put in here, right? But like I say, if you want to be data oriented, you want these buckets to contain things by value and not like pointers to things that are stored somewhere else, right? Because those indirections are what makes your program really slow and complicated, actually. However, in our game, we always think about entities as being entity pointers. Let me show you one of the main, actually the only place where this is set to true is in our entity manager. Whoops, wrong source tree. So I'm not sure why I import that here. Probably don't need to. So here we have this thing where we say it's a bucket array of 100 entities per bucket. And by the way, iterate this by pointer. And what that does is it just lets us, when we do a for loop, we don't have to put the pointer there, but we'll get a pointer to the entity back. And the reason that's just useful is because around the whole engine, we think about entities as being pointers to entities because we never want to copy entities by value. And so it's just a convenience. Like it's like I think of entities as being a pointer to a thing, and when I iterate over them, I just don't want to have to specify that all 10 billion times that we do this iteration, right? So that's all. It's just a little extra parameter to like juice this, right? And so, oh, and the reason that matters is because this entity array is two things. First, it's the thing that controls the memory for all the entities, right? It's where they actually live. But second, it's also the thing that lets you iterate over all the entities, right? It's the thing that's the canonical collection of what all entities exist. Because we're being data oriented, those are the same thing, right? Whereas in a lot of systems, you might have entities allocated on the heap, and then there's pointers to them put into some array somewhere that says what all the entities are that are alive, right? We want to be faster than that, but we're giving you the same semantics where, okay, here's where the memory is stored, but when you iterate over this thing, you get the pointers. Does heavily using macros affect executable size like heavily using inline functions does? Even if it does, I think there's some trade-offs seems worth it. Yes, it would. It definitely increases the size of your code because what's happening is a copy of that function is basically being pasted down where you're using it. So yes, code size definitely affected. But here's the thing. If you look at what like Clang or other LLVM-based compilers do, they spend a lot of their time trying to find things to inline, like a lot of their time. So like, why not save it the work? Like, why make something that has to get inlined and then figure out how to inline it, right? Why not just start with it inlined, right? You'll go faster, both at compile time and runtime. Do iterators have to be macros? They do because otherwise the stuff that's in the body of the iteration would not have a way to happen, right? Like if the iteration function was a regular function and not a macro, then you would need to put the body stuff into a capturing closure in order for it to get passed and run. And we do not have those in this language at this time. I could see if we support closures later, letting it be either a function or a code type. But we do not do that right now. Other than defer, like lock, unlock macros, what practical uses have you found for these macros over standard code? Are these macros made to solve the main two problems of not having constructor, destructor, and iterators? If so, why not have a form of attribute system that encodes those ideas? Is for expansion implicit macro? Why not make it be called explicitly within a for loop instead? Like, you're talking about very minor syntactic changes over what I just showed, and I don't care about syntax, so I don't understand. Oh, if you mean for x colon expand a, where expand a returns like an array of things to iterate over, or like a, what do you call it? Like a lazy evaluated stream or whatever? The answer is because that's way slower. The goal of this iteration system is to the goal of this system is to let you say high level things like we're doing here and have it be as fast as if you'd hand coded it every time. That's the goal. In the tripler code polynomial example, are there three functions of the polynomial function? Are there three copies of the polynomial function? Yes. I did that because it's stupid, right? If you didn't want to do that, actually, you could put this out there, right? And we still see, let me put this in the right indentation, right? So this again emphasizes this is visible from this namespace down here. It is not visible from the body of tripler, right? So you get your namespaces in your code, right? If you turn on your computer science brain and you imagine the scope of this and what the parent pointer of that scope is, the parent pointer of this scope is this scope, right? It's not tripler, this scope. It's not this scope, right? So I put that down there explicitly because it's stupid. Just to show, like, hey, you could put a bunch of stuff in there. Could I demonstrate stepping through the visit files example or even the whole demo? Maybe. Let's think about that. We actually haven't worked on debug info for macros yet, so I'm not sure if it's correct. I didn't have time to test it out before the demo. But certainly in principle, there's nothing stopping it. We'll give it a try once we get through the questions, and we'll see how it goes. Can you pass parameters to for expansions, like for only set or unset true? You cannot do that right now. It very strictly wants a function with 4 parameters. If it makes sense to widen that up, we could think about that. When is next time to be expected? I don't know, man. Can you show how the for loop reversal helps make Sokoban's code more data-oriented? No, it's not the reversal that makes it more data-oriented. It's the pointer grabbing. I think I've explained that already sufficiently enough. Say you're a Luddite and really love old school C templates. C doesn't have templates, so I'm not sure what you're talking about. How hard would it be to write a program printer that takes a source file and outputs the code with all the macros expanded? What? Do you mean for this language? It wouldn't be hard. You get all that information in the syntax tree. You get both the original macro call and then what it expanded to. And we're probably going to talk about that a lot in the next demo, because that'll interplay a lot with what we will show next time. What is the syntax for $T array saying? Yes, it's a type restriction. We have demos about that on YouTube. How do function pointers work with macros? What do you mean? Could you elaborate on how the compiler knows which for expansion to use for which type? It's just a regular function overloading resolve. So it just looks up for expansion with this set of parameters. And the first parameter is the type of the thing that you're iterating over, and that just gets resolved in overloading like any function call would. Can backticks work without expand or insert internal? No, they don't make sense in the body of a regular function. We don't actually error on that right now. We should, but we just haven't finished all the macro functionality. This is a mid-functionality demo, so you don't actually get an error message if you do that, but it doesn't mean anything. Could we have macros that have the last first parameter as a code parameter be called with a scope after them as if they were a keyword? Oh, you mean like the trailing scope thing like Swift does? Maybe. Like, I'm not sure that that matters very much. And the problem with that I'm not actually sure if there's a problem with that. Like, you need to be able to have a sane parsing process, you need to be able to know that that's like a trailing lambda or whatever they call it before you go look up the function, right? And we might do that. I've thought about it. It's just not that important. Is making this language debugger friendly a priority? Yeah. We have to use debuggers relatively often when we're making the game, so yeah. It seems like whether you insert or insert internal should be known by the macro caller anyway, so it makes more sense to me that code and code internal would be different types. Yeah, I thought about that. In fact, that was my original idea, was to have them be different types. There are implementation reasons why I didn't end up going that way, but if it ends up making sense later to have them be different types, then maybe we do that. It's definitely a little bit more self-documenting if you look at the parameter list and you see internal or not. So we'll see what that turns into. How have you handled defer for heap allocated values and double free pitfalls? I don't think I understand the question. What does defer have to do with heap allocation, except that you might defer free something? And if you do a double free, that's a mistake whether you do it with defer or not. So what are you asking? Have I thought about including macro structs? I'm not sure what a macro struct would mean. Unless you mean a macro that expands just in a data scope, which is on the planned list. It's just not a thing yet. Can you pass a code array, as in brackets code, to a macro? Not like that, because the brackets type is a runtime type. Like the macro needs to be able to know that what's in it is constant. You could probably pass a $t, right? Like a template parameter that stands in for a constant array of like 5 codes or 7 codes or however many you put. And that would probably work. I haven't tried it. So I do not warrant at this time that that would work, but I think it probably would. In early videos, you had mentioned mechanisms for alerting a programmer to how much complexity was in their code. Any plans? There's plenty of plans. I just can't do everything at once, man. Are there members on the code type? For example, in the bubble sort example, I might want to check that A and B are used and no other internal variable. There are not members on the code type per se, but you will be able to inspect them more thoroughly than we show here, and that'll be something for the next demo. Can you clarify the constraints under which code becomes implicit and when you have to explicitly type it out? Okay. The deal is the following. Because macros are regular functions, when you evoke one, like when I say tripler here with this print, the compiler doesn't know if it's a macro or not until after it's even done type checking on all the arguments, right? Because to do overload resolution, what do you need? You need the name of the procedure. You need the types and possibly name assignments and however many arguments there are, right? So we need to know the types of all the arguments, which means they need to be resolved within our local scope, all the identifiers, right? So if I use some identifier that is not declared in my scope without the macro, then I have to put code, right? If I happen to only really use things, then I do have to put code. Or I think in this case, I don't think this will work if I get rid of the code here. That might be something that we fix. Yeah. So the reason we need that one is because normally you can't just open a scope and have there be a block as an expression, where you would have an expression in the language. And code sort of knows to look for a block or an expression, so we're using that in that case. But if you were just going to have things that normally could be function arguments, okay, the rule is you don't need code if this would work if it was just a function. Does that make sense? If this would compile and type check, if this was just a function, you don't need to say code. Other than the recursive insert thing, did you have to do any work to get good error messages for other types of programmer mistakes with macros? I would say, I had to do some basic work in the beginning, but, as we more heavily use macros in production, we'll run into lots of cases where errors are not good, and then we'll make them good. This is all relatively new functionality. Like, all of this went in the past few weeks. So. Can a variadic macro expand its arguments without relying on a runtime for loop, which I'm assuming makes an array to lump the args into, and which may or may not be optimized away, like C++ template argument packs, and fold expressions, or maybe some kind of static for loop? Okay. I don't think that I do this yet, so I'm not going to try to demo it, but in principle, so we do have a varargs macro, right? Whoops. Dude, I just hit some unknown hotkeys. Let me get back to the chat. Okay, so we did have a varargs macro, right? It was here. But we don't try to use the values in a compile time way. If you wanted to iterate over this at compile time, you could use a run directive probably to do that. But what we really should do is, instead of making the runtime array of unknown length, when we make varargs and we know it's a macro, we could make it a compile time array that's just like these, right? And then these you can evaluate as constant expressions, right? So if you say fruits.count, right, or fruits sub 2, both of these get evaluated at compile time. And so you would get that ability. We just don't have it yet. Okay, everybody, I have a problem. The problem is I accidentally hit some weird keys in my Twitch window, and every question after the ones that I've answered got refreshed and is gone. So if you could repaste your question if I haven't answered it yet. I apologize, but it's the web. Under the hood, is there a copy and pasting happening that permits the compiler to optimize better? Yes, you could think of this as just copy and pasting. That's what a macro expansion is. In a for expansion macro, shouldn't it be automatically defined as a value or pointer? What happens if you set it to value when the user requested by pointer? Then they'll just get something that's a value, and they'll be confused about what type it was. It can't automatically be defined because the compiler doesn't know what it's supposed to be. Only you know what it's supposed to be. Can you limit what variables are visible to the insertee when you do insert internal? I'm worried that the current setup leads to leaky abstractions. But I mean, okay. Right now you cannot. There may be features later that let you do that. I wouldn't be that worried preemptively about leaky abstractions here. It's way less leaky than C. And C macros get used all the time very productively. So there's such a thing as being preemptively worried. We just have to see what happens. The plan is to use this stuff in a lot of ways. See what actually happens when we use it, and then see what's necessary based on that. An earlier example had a macro that declared it, but then the next few lines referred to it. Why didn't those lines use backtick it? Okay, let me go to one of those. Let's see. Okay, like this one is very simple actually. So the question is like, hey, this has a backtick, but these don't. Why not? And that's true for all the iterators that we looked at. So answer number one is, it's two answers. Answer number one is you don't want to have to put backtick everywhere. That's annoying. Answer number two is when you do this kind of declaration, this variable is actually in your local scope and in the other function scope. What happens is a link that's kind of like a symbolic link in a file system gets made between that scope and this scope, so that it knows where to find the variable, right? Now, there's an extra twist in that if it's a for loop expansion, this gets renamed. So it might not actually be called it, right? And so then if you insist on calling it backtick it, then if it gets renamed, you won't get the right variable probably. And I could go rename all of that, but that just starts sounding gross, so that's not how it actually works. You're not talking about a syntactic thing per se, but rather what are the actual practical uses of this solution rather than a generic solution. I was suggesting still inlining at the S level, but I was specific for iteration itself. It was specific for iteration itself. Can see the use of code for sort algorithms. Maybe you're making a dual argument for anti-Lisp. What tools do you need to solve the problems rather than what single solution to solve? Well, okay, so it's very hard to have this discussion in absence of part 2 of this demo, because part 2 of this demo is going to continue out what I showed here and show how it ties into everything else in the language more thoroughly, right? So this may seem like a cul-de-sac of language functionality, but actually this connects back in interwebs with everything else in a very effective way. And I can't explain that till it's finished. So that'll be next demo. Back on the macro struct question, a macro struct would be a macro used to help in building up struct declarations. Random bad example, you have a global compile time array of type infos or something, and your macro struct would iterate over that to declare a struct member for every entry. Well, you already can do that. Like you can do that with run directives or meta programs or all that. Like we don't need to add another way for you to do that. That's fine. Are modules next to be demoed or at least close? I'm not sure. Either modules or macros part 2 is next. Have I heard of the Zig language, which has similar compile time expansion? I surely know about Zig. I haven't looked at what it does for macros. When you define a macro that contains a run directive, does the run directive get executed once per expansion? The answer to that is the rules for macros there. Well, I was about to say they're the same as for polymorphic functions, but that might not help. Basically, the run directive does not run if it's in the macro, because macros are not real code. They can't be compiled into real functions, right? Because the types of things in this function might depend on what this is, right? And we have no idea what that is. So, the body of this doesn't actually compile into anything until you insert it somewhere, right? So assert directives or run directives will not do anything in here. When you expand it, then obviously that run directive gets inserted into the body of your function, right? And that's where it'll run. And so yes, that run directive would run once for each expansion of that macro in the program. And it's actually a little bit different from polymorphic functions because polymorphic functions get deduplicated, right? So if you call one twice with the same type arguments or types of arguments, those will refer to the same function instance. Whereas with macros, that's not true. The macros will get expanded every time. Can macros be used to serialize and deserialize structs? I mean, sure, but you can already do that without macros, so I'm not sure why you're asking that. Macros introduce the possibility of things happening non-explicitly, which could lead to confusing code. Would you consider a no macro directive that doesn't allow macro expansions within that scope? I think I understand why people may want that kind of thing. We may want that kind of thing sometimes, but I would rather work toward a system where you have a meta program that implements house rules like that, right? Like you can have a user level tag called no macro and your meta program makes sure that there aren't any macros in there or whatever. And so rather than implementing specific compiler functionality for every little thing like that, I want to make sure the system is general and good enough that it could do that as well as other things. Is it possible to pass in custom variable names for macros that require you to reference variables inside the macro? pass in custom variable names. Can you give me an example of what you're asking? Because I'm not sure. What if you have nested macros and you want to refer to variables that are up two scopes? Can you use a double backtick? Double backtick doesn't mean anything right now. Backtick just means start looking in the outer scope where I'm inserted. So if you're two macros deep, it would look at the inside the outer macro. I didn't really want to get into double, triple, quadruple backticks. I suppose we could do that eventually, but before encouraging people to go crazy and write gnarly spaghetti referential things, I just want to see how this plays out. And then we'll see. Doesn't the compiler know that the for loop is by pointer? You have special syntax for it. Surely the compiler knows that it should be a pointer. No, I mean, you're ascribing slightly more magic to the compiler than is really useful, I think. Do I have count leading zeros intrinsics that you could use to implement the only set binary bit array iterator? We have not implemented that one yet, but for sure that would be a good application of it, right? I mean, either leading zeros or trailing zeros. Why does the inner macro not need backtick for node in the... I think I explained that. It's the same as this. So I think you're asking about... oh, wait, no, node is even different. Node is just a parameter. Like, that's just a function parameter here. So why would you need a backtick? It's in the namespace of this routine. If that's what you're asking. Oh, wait, you're asking about, oh, the left or right one? So in here, this is a little bit of a funny corner case, actually. I'm not sure if we should make this illegal or not. OK. What's going on is a node is being looked up lexically from the scope of this. But this guy is locally scoped to this procedure. So he could see node, and node is an argument of the procedure. Now, if this was a function, that would be illegal without a closure, which we don't support, right? So we would say, hey, buddy, you can't refer to something in the outer procedure stack frame. But we can because we're in that function and we're being pasted inside that function. Do you know what I'm saying? So it's a little bit of a cheat. Like, I didn't actually do it intentionally, but it's actually kind of cool. Like, that might be an extra reason to locally scope things. I don't know. I need to think about that one. Good question, actually. I was confused by the question at first, but no, it's a good point. This is only legal because it's a macro and not a function. Am I open to this expanding to more functional bread and butter, like partial evaluation into currying a la Haskell, or do you want it tightly bound? Yeah, I don't understand the question. If you want to ask a more specific question. If a code block causes a syntax error in the macro, is the error highlighted in the function that's calling the macro or the macro itself? It should be in the function that's calling the macro. Our error messages are probably not as good as they could be ultimately on this. Like you want to know both. You want to say it happened on this line, but in the macro expansion on this line, and here's the location of the macro. You actually want all three things. And I'm pretty sure we don't do that right now. But let's go to this one where we had code with braces, and we're going to say right? Actually, no. Okay, so first of all, syntax error and like undeclared identifier and stuff are different. Whatever you pass in for code has to be syntactically sound already. So this should just give us a syntax error where you expect. Yeah. Like, okay, we didn't like that. If you say y is some variable, right? So then you get undeclared identifier. Now, the reason we're going to want to go and report that it's during this macro expansion and stuff is you might have thought that this was supposed to be declared in the macro and you typoed it. So we don't quite give you as much information as would be useful to debug it in all cases yet, and that's just on the to-do list. How does overloading resolution disambiguate between a procedure and a macro? It doesn't. Oh, foo versus code. The way it works is casting, okay, this gets casted to a code, and that implicit cast has like a casting distance associated with it. So something that didn't take code that was a closer match on the type would match first. It's like anything with overloading, right? There's a sequence of priority of what things are considered further away and what things are not. And so macros don't actually add anything new to that. It's just the fact that this is implicitly casted to code. Is there a compiler option to output the code generated after the macro expansions? You can see that in your metaprogram, and we'll look at that next time. What does the for line look like when you use a custom iterator and also rename it? Okay. Let's go back to our for colon only set. Okay. Let's do, let's go here. And the answer is, the way it works, so, you have this and that and this, right? Those are the operations that you can have. And those go before your value names, right? So a for loop is normally like for x, comma I, whatever, and then body, right? So here, it's just these things have to go before those. So if we wanted to do this down here, we're going to call this value and n. I just don't want something that looks like index. So we're going to say n in value, right? Whoa, what did I just do? Guys, I broke something. Something with my like undeclared identifier. I don't know what even just happened. Wow. That's scary. What did I break? This is like not even a user-facing error. This is a compiler bug. Well, I'm sure glad we got through the demo without that. When I was talking about this, did I like change something? Let's see what happens if we do this. Still doesn't like it. I am so confused, people. All right, well, I'll debug that later. I'm just going to comment this out for now. Oh, it was probably... I don't know. I don't know. All right. Anyway, okay, so I didn't put a new line, but we're saying bit 3 has value false, etc. So there you go. It's a different colon in a different place. In your in-order function, the locally defined left to right doesn't use a backtick. Okay, so I answered that one, I believe. So compile time remove equals hash assert false would work instead of runtime. It should. Let's try it out. I don't think I ever tested that. Let's go to bit array, right? So we're going to say that. So let's first of all make sure that we compile. OK, great. That as I claimed would happen, this didn't go off. So then I'm going to say if n is equal to 10, remove value, right? Uh-oh. OK. That didn't work. That did not work. Oh, wait. I did it in the wrong one again. See, this one is the underscore one. OK, let's try again. I hope someone caught that. There we go. See, programming languages actually work sometimes. Compile time assertion failed. Now, the problem here is this error message isn't as good as it could be, because it's telling us where this pasted assertion is. And I guess we can understand that that's the remove, but it also should point at this, right? I should point at this line and say that's the problem. In fact, this kind of sucks because it's not telling us the source line of code at all. Let me write this one down. Two things to write down: bug and better error on assert in macro. Like, this is fine if you just made a few changes and recompile and you know what code you were working on. But if you just made a bunch of changes or whatever, or you pull in a new data structure and like, I have no indicator right now what line of code actually caused this. That's bad. That's always bad when that happens. So we need to fix that. What happens if you expand definer twice in the same scope? You should get a redefined identifier, right? So if I go definer 42, definer 999, that should give me an error. Oh, hold on. We've got to take out our remove. OK. Yeah. Redeclaration of negation. So again, it's not telling us what line the macro was called on. It's just telling us that we goofed. right? So this falls into the same category of we need to work on that. It's about to ask about the house rule stuff. Is that a planned part of the next demo? No, dude, the house rules have been in the language for years. Being able to statically analyze something to like MISRA-C standards using user level code sounds awesome. Well, you might be interested in my YouTube video where I write a meta program that makes sure that code conforms to MISRA-C rules. Really interesting that you mentioned that because such a thing actually exists. What happens if you call your for loop variable named it? Then it's fine. It's essentially a no-op. You just get the name it. I think it would be more consistent to write backtick defer in the macro if you want the defer to be for the outer scope. That's an interesting idea. Let me think about that one. That's an interesting idea. Worth considering. Is there a mechanism to allow a macro written using e.g. backtick value to operate on my variable called value2 instead? Not currently, but we may be able to do that in the next demo. I know using the call stack recursion is slower, but would it even be possible to write the in order for expansion with recursion? Well, you can't do a recursive macro, right? Because it would expand infinitely. So anything recursive can't be a macro, and any macro can't be recursive unless it was somehow compile time recursive, right? And you bounded the expansion. That said, like navigating things recursively is often not the best way anyway. It's often the shortest amount of code, but it's often slow, etc. Could you pass an identifier as a parameter to a macro to be used to refer to a name in the outer scope? Like setter macro myvar 10, which would expand to myvar equals 10. That'll definitely be possible next time. I'm not sure if it is possible right now. And it may depend on things. If I wasn't 2.5 hours into the stream, I would start playing with it. Do assert support a message? Yes, I just don't typically use it. Does it make any sense to view for's reverse and pointer as special kind of iterators? For that point of view, a for loop is a composition of 3 iterators, reverse, pointer, and a custom one. Is there any plans on supporting composition of several? No, I mean, okay, so here's the thing. The whole C++ iterator scheme, where you create an iterator and you plus it or minus it or whatever, that whole scheme is sort of made so that you can arbitrarily functionally compose iterators or implement high-level algorithms given just an iterator or whatever, right? And I never want to do that. I want real world, down to the metal, like iterate over these things. That's all I ever want to do. if I wanted to make some high-level frooey thing, I would write custom code for that anyway, because I'd want to be able to optimize it to something reasonable. So this whole system it's optimizing for what I actually want to do in actual code, and not like what the weird computer science textbook that's relatively impractical says in the limit you might want to eventually maybe do a couple times. Do you know what I'm saying? Did you drop the multiple iterators at once idea, or is it still in the list? I'm not sure what you're asking. We demoed using different iterators today. Wow, okay, that was all the questions that were addressed to me. We don't have for loops that do arbitrary things like C for loops, though you can always write a complicated while loop to do so. Sounds like a use for macros, if that's something you often do. It might be informative to see a macro being created real time. Could you illustrate what writing a macro to simulate a C-style for loop would be like? I mean, that's just not quite how it works. You could make one, like okay, you could make that, but it would just look like a function call. It wouldn't look, so, I mean, this ABA example, okay. So this ABA example is kind of like what it would be like, right? Where you say initial condition, right? After every step, or wait, what is it? Initial condition, break condition, and step condition. There would be like an A, B, and C, and you would insert them. Now, with the current things that I've demoed, the thing is that it would probably be annoying to use, because you'd probably have to use code directives on all three of those. So it wouldn't, like, the purpose of this system is not to let you make arbitrary syntax in the language, right? So it wouldn't look like, if you wanted something that looked exactly like a C for loop, you would have to have your own preprocessor to do that. Because that is not the goal here. It is not necessarily desirable, because what happens a lot of the time is when people start making wacky syntax all over the place, you go look at someone's code and you just don't understand what's going on, right? That's actually what happened in the Lisp world a lot. So the goal here is that if something really funny is going on, you see it, right? And that implies certain things. And so if you were to do a for loop like that, I mean, I don't think it would be that useful of a thing as a replacement for a for loop. I mean, definitely if it was just like a complicated function that you drop pieces in. Is for expansion a special keyword? No. It is just the name of the function, and all that happens is the for loop, when it looks for a custom definition, it looks up something called for expansion unless you give it a different name. What happens if you insert a backtick outside a macro? Right now, it's just silently ignored. It probably will be an error unless we find some good and useful meaning for it that's not error prone. But right now, it's just silently ignored. All right. Thank you so many people for coming today. And so many people stayed until the end. It's been almost 3 hours, 2.5 at least. And like way more than half the people are still here. So, well, maybe many of those people showed up in the middle. Who knows? But thanks everyone for coming by. So we're going to do another. So first of all, if you missed any of this, the demo and the Q&A will be posted on YouTube before too long, probably tomorrow sometime. And I will definitely tweet those out. We're going to do a continuation of this probably not before a few weeks from now, because the rest of the functionality is substantial. And as we mentioned, there's a few things to take care of here for me to work on. Yeah, I will, of course, put news out when there is news time. This is like the polymorphism demo all over again. In what way? Modules demo soon? Maybe, I don't know. I'm just going to work on these. So definitely more module stuff has to happen. Definitely more macro stuff has to happen. And well, I'm just going to work on them as it seems to make sense. So whichever demo happens next will depend on what gets worked on. Still up for stepping through a macro. Let's try it. I feel like it may not be good, but let's see what happens. Let's pick a... I want to look at a simple one. Like I have all these little, maybe the backtick macro. Oh, well, the backtick macros don't have a lot going on in this function. How about definer test? Like that's easy. That's simple, right? We call a macro, we do the thing. Who knows if it'll work or not? Come on, Visual Studio. I just had this open. All right. All right, so we put a breakpoint there. We're going to start. Okay, definer of 42. We step in. We're in the macro. Negation, square, there, there. Okay. Whoa, but now we're on the wrong line all of a sudden. What? Do we have a control M? What's going on? No. So something is actually confusing it about what line it's on, which is weird. I'm not sure what that would be. It's something in the code between there and here. So now we're like off by 1. Let's see. So for loop, whoa, no, it's just, yeah, it's off by 1 anywhere in main. What a pain in the butt. Usually that means there's a control M in the file, but this one, it may actually be our debugger outputting for some reason. I'm going to need to look at it. It's quite possible it's our bug. No combined small features demo. We may probably do one of those as well. there will be enough for small features at some point. This for loop stuff was going to be in the small feature demo, but then I figured I'll explain it here so that we could use it in the macros. Yeah. All right. Thank you all for coming by. I'm going to go get some food and relax. And maybe we'll do a gaming stream later tonight when I come back. It's quite possible. It's always great to see so many people interested in this kind of stuff. And let's not try to raid somebody right now. I'm just going to go relax for a bit. But see you all later.